The project that invokes all of our efforts around substance use disorder started several years ago by the initiatives that were collaborative between Marshall University, the School of Medicine, Marshall Health Network, and the city. This comprehensive approach resulted in outstanding success, and our success is now being recognized as a methodology that encompasses not only the elements of the biological components that lead to substance use disorder, but also the social determinants of this problem and all the elements that lead to the integration and reintegration of patients as they go through all the steps of substance use withdrawal and recovery in order to reintegrate society as valued and productive members of the society. Two programs were developed, one called PROACT, which has really resulted in wonderful outcomes, and the second, a program specifically designed for women who are pregnant and who are also substance use disorder sufferers. In that program, very similarly, would bring these unique individuals with their families, with their children, to a protected environment that will not only afford them the treatment that they need, but also train them into how to foster a family environment that is supportive to their children at the same time that they get reintegrated through professional development and incorporation into society with jobs and being productive citizens. These two projects, which were really built around a lot of community-based effort and philanthropy, are now going to be hopefully expanded into many other counties of West Virginia, and hopefully through that will serve as a demonstration to the rest of the United States and the world of a methodology that ultimately should result in a substantial relief of the unique problems that substance use disorder bring not only to the people that suffer from them, but to those that are dear to them, to the communities, to the country, and to the economic welfare of everybody.
We're going to take a look at the opioid crisis. How did it get started? How did prescription pain pills lead to today's heroin and fentanyl epidemic? In order to understand that, we first got to understand addiction. For a long time, addiction has been looked at as a moral failure, and it is absolutely not a moral failure. It is a disorder of the brain. Addiction has been known to be a disorder of the brain since the late 1700s. What are the risk factors? What leads people to addiction? And what's the difference between dependence and addiction? Because these two terms are often intertwined and misunderstood. So let's start off with addiction. Addiction is continued use of a substance despite consequences. How I always explain it is this: if you get a DUI, does that mean you have an alcohol use disorder? Absolutely not. I'm not condoning drinking and driving, but a single DUI standalone does not mean you have alcohol use disorder. What about a second DUI? Absolutely. Now you have to start looking at alcohol use disorder. Why? Addiction is continued use despite consequences. And when you got a DUI, you spent 48 hours in jail in every state in the United States. It cost you money for an attorney. And a lot of times we put your mugshot in the newspaper to shame you. There were consequences. If you continue to drink in the face of consequences, that is addiction.
Looking back, my addiction started at a young age because of trauma in my life. I was molested by an uncle. I was molested by my dad's father. And that's how I started to cope with the trauma in my life.
Addiction a lot of times is confused with the word dependence. What does dependence mean? Dependence means when I stop doing something, taking whatever chemical, I go through what's called a predictable physiologic withdrawal syndrome. We understand that in the world we work in as being dope sick. Now, do all drugs cause this predictable physiologic syndrome, i.e. withdrawals? Absolutely not. The drugs that cause withdrawal syndromes that are common are opioid pain medication and benzodiazepines like Valium, Xanax, Klonopin, and alcohol. So what it simply means is that after a prolonged period of use, and that period of time is going to be dependent upon the drug, and I abruptly stop taking it, I get sick. I go through a predictable physiologic withdrawal syndrome. That syndrome lasts based on the half-life of the drug. So heroin has a short half-life. Half-life means the time it takes half the drug to get out of your system. So if I'm using heroin and I abruptly stop it and I have developed dependence to it, my body is going to react by getting sick. And that sickness is going to be dependent upon the half-life of the drug. So with heroin, it's short. So take a drug like OxyContin. long half-life. A drug like methadone, long half-life. Those drugs, it takes longer to get to the peak of the symptoms, and it takes longer to get out of your system, sometimes up to 2 weeks. So that is the difference between dependence and addiction. I can get anybody dependent if I give them the drug long enough and it causes dependence. Addiction is continued use despite consequences, and these are two separate things.
I'm Dr. Todd Davies, PhD, I'm the Associate Director of Research in the Division of Addiction Sciences here at the Joan C. Edwards School of Medicine at Marshall University. In my division and in my role, we integrate research across all of our clinical activity. We do a lot of translational research. For example, we do research across the continuum of care, whether it's new medications for substance use disorder or specifically opioid use disorder. We have new treatments that we're running studies on for neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome, or NOWS, also known as NAS. We're running studies looking at Hep C in pregnant women, new treatments and protocols for pregnant women, particularly with substance use disorders where there's going to be a prenatal exposure. So we've done a lot of work in that area. We also do a lot of translational work because, we look at new medications, and that's an important part of research, and that's an important part specifically of clinical research and identifying new treatments. But we're trying to look beyond that. We want to look at the whole continuum of care. As people come in, in a bad situation, but as they transition and get healthier and healthier across their treatment, we want to be able to adapt to that. We want to be able to remove a lot of those both internal and external barriers. And so we're doing a lot of research on epigenetics, looking at, we've identified some specific areas in which the genes are modified in the stress response system of the body. And so we've identified some areas where there's some modifications there. We are looking at nutritional deficiencies in this population because those can be pretty significant barriers in terms of people getting into recovery, getting into a place where they can self-manage their condition, which is the ultimate goal.
How in the world did pain pills become widely available and socially acceptable? In the early 1990s, pain societies began to say that we're undertreating pain and that we're too scared of opioid pain medication, and that these drugs weren't near as addictive as we thought they were, particularly if we use one that's long-acting. And there was a little company on the East Coast called Purdue Pharma that happened to have one of these long-acting drugs. They're called OxyContin. And OxyContin supposedly, because of its long half-life, had less potential for addiction. So the pharmaceutical industry promoted OxyContin as having a less than 1% chance of addiction, which was not true. And so you take a highly addictive drug and unleash it on a genetically predisposed and traumatized population, and you wind up where we are today.
We have a nonprofit, More Than Addiction. It's an advocacy nonprofit to help reduce stigma and change the narrative and raise awareness around substance use disorder. I also work for PRTS, that's Peer Recovery Therapy Services, based out of Charleston. It's a behavioral health organization where we work with individuals trying to help them get back into the workforce and overcome barriers with their recovery. I'd like to think that my journey to addiction started at the age of 4. I was born into a single family, a single mother home. My mother and father never were married. My father wasn't really a part of my life. I was in an abusive home. Most of the time my discipline came in the form of whatever was within arm's reach of my mother at the time. So there was a lot of aggression, a lot of verbal abuse, a lot of physical abuse. I really didn't give a whole lot of thought to my drug use until I got into my mid-20s, and I was prescribed painkillers for a back injury. I was severely overprescribed. But I remember when I did the painkillers, when I introduced those into my life and into my body, I felt like I could finally breathe. I felt at ease. It gave me a sense of peace and of comfort that I really hadn't experienced yet. And I'm like, this is what I've been looking for my whole life, this right here.
How in the world did we go from pain pills to today's heroin and fentanyl epidemic? Well, if we look back, and you see somebody starts taking pain pills, and it could be from a legitimate prescription, and then they start to develop tolerance, and they need more and more for less and less effect, and they can't stop taking it or they get sick. And then what we did in the United States is we said, oh, hang on a second. We're misprescribing pain medication. We have a bunch of pill mills around that are basically selling prescriptions. Let's shut down those pill mills. Let's teach our providers, our prescribers, our doctors, our nurse practitioners, our physician's assistants, how to more properly prescribe these pain medications, which we need, which is all well and good. But what do you do with the people who are already addicted? And what do you do with people who are getting started now through proper prescriptions that go on to develop an opioid addiction? Because traditionally we have not had the resources to help those people from a treatment standpoint. So when you do that and you put the prescribing guidelines in place and you start looking at prescription monitoring data banks, which is what doctors and nurse practitioners and physician's assistants query before they write a prescription so that you don't have people going to multiple doctors. When you do all that, and you limit the number of pain pills that are out there and limit the number of pain pills that are available for diversion, what do people do when that supply draws up? They don't just quit using, because remember, they get sick and their cravings are higher than our cravings are for food when we're hungry and water when they're thirsty. So they wind up going to street. And people who would have never used heroin before suddenly will use heroin because they can't be sick and their cravings are so bad. So now you have people who got started on pain medication. When that supply dried up, it's replaced in the market by cheap heroin.
Everybody asked me, what was your drug of choice? More. Just more. It didn't really matter what, you know. In an attempt to escape this moment, I would introduce anything that I thought could get me there. Drinking was never my thing, but I would drink. You know what I mean? It wasn't my preference, but I would do it. You know, I was the guy that give it to him, he'll try it, you know. So I went through the motions of painkillers, stimulants, back and forth. Because what I noticed was in my addicted mind, I thought I could manage my painkiller and opioid addiction if I used stimulants, because I wouldn't withdraw from the opioids if I was doing, say, cocaine or something, right? That didn't work. That was a terrible decision. Eventually, I became a father. That turned into him being seized by CPS. 4 police agencies raided my home. There were 6 adults, 3 children under the age of 12, and 4 active meth labs in my home. And I was arrested and looking at 6 to 30 years in prison. And CPS showed up that night and took my son for the second time. And he was 4 years old. And when the caseworker was holding him by the hand and walking him away to her vehicle, he turned around and looked at me and said, "Daddy, I love you. I'll never forget you." Got 4 years old.
And I think most of us saw heroin coming on. I certainly did. What I didn't see coming on was fentanyl. And back 7, 8 years ago, we started seeing fentanyl on the streets in the United States. And what fentanyl is it is a synthetic opioid. It is basically taking the opioid that comes out of a natural poppy plant, altering it chemically by man to make it stronger and longer acting. And it's much more powerful. And so when I first started hearing about fentanyl, I thought we were talking about fentanyl coming out of the hospital. And I thought, there's no way that you could get enough fentanyl out of the hospital to be significant on the streets from a diversion standpoint. I never dreamed of fentanyl being made clandestinely in countries like China and brought into the United States through Canada and Mexico and pressed into pills that look just like what's coming out of the pharmacy, or adulterated in heroin, adulterated in marijuana, adulterated in basically anything that you can buy off the street, including cocaine and methamphetamine.
Over the last sort of 15 years of doing treatment with MOUD, it's been very interesting to see the changes that have occurred in the local drug supply. When I first started, it was very clearly all prescription opioids, and then in time, sort of transitioned to heroin, and then we slowly began to see fentanyl in the heroin. And now it's very rare that we see heroin, and we're seeing primarily fentanyl, but we're seeing a significant uptake in xylazine, which many people know sort of as a horse tranquilizer. which is making treatment a lot more difficult because it's more difficult to maintain and sort of control those withdrawal symptoms in patients when they're being exposed to multiple substances. We've also seen sort of 2 rounds of methamphetamine use and abuse. In the earlier days of sort of our treatment program, we would see the typical shake and bake that was using the Sudafed or the decongestant pseudoephedrine for making the methamphetamine. And now we're sort of seeing the other formulation, which is primarily made overseas or sort of coming across the borders, and that's using P2P, and it's very complicated and sort of very difficult to sort of treat. Methamphetamine typically releases so much dopamine that is highly addictive. So we're constantly having to change our treatment model, sort of the drug supply changes, and so we're in a constant sort of flux of sort of quality evaluation and determining what needs to be done to provide better quality here at our programs at Marshall.
I think you can see how scary this is. Today, you don't have to have an addiction. You don't have to have developed dependence. You can just use one pill and die. And I'll give you an example. Kids have parties. They're at the experimenting age, particularly late in teenage year. And you get somebody who brings pills to a party, and you happen to pull one of those pills out of a glass jar or whatever, a bowl that they're being passed around in, and you get a hold of what you think looks like an oxycodone, only it's not oxycodone, it's fentanyl. You take one pill and you die. That is the scariest thing about today's fentanyl epidemic.
Looking back, my addiction started at a young age because of trauma in my life. I was molested by an uncle. I was molested by my dad's father. And that's how I started to cope with the trauma in my life. For some reason, that led me to believe sex was all I had to offer to people. Sex was how I was going to be loved. So that opened up the door to a sex addiction. So that's what I thought I had to be good at. And to be able to cope with that, I started drinking more. I started using other drugs. That was a mask. That was me making myself numb. I have 4 daughters, and they really suffered. And to me, that was opening the door in their lives for the same thing to happen to them, for them to struggle with addiction. And a couple of them have in their lives. And looking back, that's hard. I met somebody new. We eventually were engaged, and he passed away suicide by cop. It was a very violent. I was struggling, wanting to take my own life. So I went to him, and he put me on several different medications, one of them being Xanax. I was at the point where I was taking 8 Xanax a day. I am in active use again with these pills. Prior to that, I justified it. I justified it in my head because a doctor prescribed me this medication. So if the doctor prescribed it, it's okay. When in reality, being prescribed all those medications and not even told that they could become addictive, therefore I'm in full-blown addiction again.
Our approach has got to be, let's keep people alive, and let's keep them alive long enough. We give their brain time to recover, and let's go after those underlying drivers of addiction and untreated mental illness. And let's do it within systems that we're measuring outcomes so we can see what's working.